Hey there, comic fans. Michael here at Ground Zero. Super glad that you guys have all decided to join us again. I know I'm not the guy that you're normally used to seeing on these little segments, but if you're an avid enough fan of our little show here, then you might remember that way back in Season 1, Episode 2 of Interestingly Enough, which covered the initial rise and fall of Valiant Comics in the early 90s, Dave promised a sequel to that episode will be showing up eventually, talking about the new incarnation of Valiant, possibly starring yours truly. So here I am with the newest episode of Interestingly Enough, which is going to cover that topic. This is going to end up being a two-part episode because the story is way twistier than I initially thought. I learned a lot doing the research for this episode, and I'm actually super excited to share it all with you because it's a crazy story. And even though it mostly focuses on the last, 10 or 12 years, we still have to pull a Dave at the start here and jump all the way back to 1993, starting with a guy by the name of Jason Kothari. Jason was a young kid living in Hong Kong, whose dad would fairly regularly make business trips back to the U.S. And on these trips, Jason would pick up a bunch of comics, because it was the early 90s, it was the in thing to do. When he would come back to Hong Kong, he would distribute these books to all of his friends. What he would typically do is all of the comics that he thought would have the least potential for, for appreciating and value later on, were the first ones that he would give out. And so that is how he happened to give a copy of XO Manowar number 6, described later as a sat-on copy, to his friend Dinesh Shamdasani. Dinesh became very enamored by this book and by any other Valiant books he could get his hands on, which wasn't very many in those early days, living in Hong Kong, not having as much access to them. But he became so enamored that by the time of his 12th birthday next year, it was Valiant themed. He had a Valiant themed cake and everything. Now, why is this picture of a 12-year-old's birthday party important to this story? Stay tuned, because Dinesh will be coming up a lot more. He's kind of the central figure in all of this. But for the moment, we're going to move sideways and talk about how Acclaim fell apart. Now, if you'll remember from the previous video talking about Valiant, Acclaim was the video game company that bought the original Valiant in 1994 and proceeded to just slowly erode everything that was initially perceived by the fans as being great about the original Valiant. It just made a series of increasingly poor decisions, culminating in so the last issue of Valiant / Acclaim comics that came out was Unity 2000 number 3 of 6. They never released the other 3 issues. They solicited issues 4 and 5 in previews, but they never came out with them. It was at that point they decided to pull the plug. Interestingly, that series was written by none other than Jim Shooter in his return to Valiant Comics, the first time he'd written any of those characters since being ousted from the company very early on. He will also come up again later on in this. But Acclaim pulls the plug at that point. The only other comic they released was a little promotional tie-in book for one of their Turok games. And Acclaim is on hard times. Their comics weren't the only thing that wasn't doing good for them. Acclaim in its final days was absolutely bonkers. They were doing things like trying to pay people to name their child Turok, like legally. They were trying to pay people to put advertising for Shadow Man's Second Coming on their family's tombstones. This is all real stuff that happened. You can look it up. It was nuts. So we're going to move sideways again. We'll come back to Acclaim in just a moment and talk about ValiantFans.com. Now, ValiantFans.com was, I think, a holdover from an earlier site. I don't have the name of that right on hand, but that was a fan site that got going in early 2004 for all of the, fans of Valiant Comics that were keeping the flame alive, even though we hadn't had a new book in quite a long time, and the glory days were long, long behind us. But that gets going, and young Dinesh is one of the early adopters of, slightly less young now, but he's one of the early adopters of that site, really becomes a big central part of the community, constantly wheeling and dealing for a lot of the rare Valiant collectibles and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, in May of 2004, there is a thread on the Valiant fans forums suggesting essentially that the group of fans pool their resources and try to acquire the Valiant characters from Acclaim. Since Acclaim wouldn't do anything with them at this point, and had largely, mishandled them prior to that, it seems like maybe something remotely feasible. Well, none other than Bob Layton chimes in to say that, he had considered this when he was starting up his Future Comics line, trying to get some of those characters from Acclaim, and it was not feasible. Plus, he had heard back from retailers that it was a non-starter for them. They still remembered Deathmate. They still remembered Birthquake. They still remembered all those boxes and boxes of Valiant issues that were at this point littering their quarter bins, because they absolutely could not sell that stuff under any circumstances, and they just did not want to even hear about any kind of return of Valiant at this point. And Dinesh participates some in this thread, but nothing more happens at this point. Layton says that the only way that this would really be all that feasible is if Acclaim were to declare bankruptcy and just become completely insolvent. Well, sure enough, 3 months later, at the end of August, Acclaim files for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Well, technically they announce it August 30th and they file on the next day, September 1st. But very quickly, Acclaim is no more, and all of their assets are kind of in limbo then at this point. We don't hear anything more about it until the end of September, when a thread goes up on the Valiant Fans Forum, where they're talking about, the Acclaim has gone belly up, what's going to happen with these characters, who should we contact about trying to get new comics made. And Dinesh pops on and says, please don't. Don't contact any of these other people. Just trust me on this. And nothing more is really said at that point. Now, there's a few references to a much longer thread about the Acclaim sale of assets, but all the links to it are dead. The Wayback Machine doesn't have it, so I was not able to find anything concrete about exactly how a lot of this went down. But here's what I do know. In June of 2005, Dinesh and his friend Jason Kothari, who initially got him hooked on this stuff, put in a bid for all of the Valiant properties. The properties went up for auction. They put in a bid. They had a business plan together. They had lined all this stuff up, and they lost. They failed. And that was it. They didn't win the auction, and that's, unfortunately for us, not where the story ends. But it probably should have. Jason and Dinesh, as the story goes, are sitting in one of their dorm rooms, surrounded by all these files that they had for all this stuff, and they get a phone call saying that the first place bid has backed out. Now, the reason that the first place bid backed out was because an anonymous third party has filed what is called an intent to use claim on the trademarks. Not on any of the characters or ideas or stuff, but just on the trademarks. So whoever the first party bid, or the first place bid was, we don't know at this point, or at least I don't know. They had backed out, and that left Jason and Dinesh with the winning bid if they wanted it. Well, they were young and stupid, and they didn't know what they were getting into, luckily for us, so they took it, and for just under $1 million, they now owned the Valiant characters, but the names, including the name Valiant itself, were contested, and would be for the next 2 years in a bare-knuckle legal brawl. Because, see, this anonymous third party had hired a very high-powered IP attorney named Michael Lovitz. And that is largely, according to most sources, what scared off the first-party bid. Jason and Dinesh, didn't know any better, so they got into this fight, and they ended up basically just waiting them out. It took 2 years of all this legal back and forth, and eventually the anonymous third party, which was calling itself Valiant Intellectual Properties, as opposed to Dinesh and Jason's Valiant Entertainment, eventually they backed down, although not before releasing at San Diego Comic-Con 2007 a sneak peek ashcan, which was numbered to 100, but there's some sources that say that there was possibly more than 100 produced, that some of them just weren't numbered. But they featured unrecognizable versions of the Valiant characters. And it's just art. There's no story or anything. It's just some full-page black and white art of these characters with Valiant names attached to them. They were trying everything they could to hold on to it. And it turns out that this anonymous third party was none other than Nick Barucci, who was starting up Dynamite Comics at the time, or Dynamite Entertainment. He was expanding out from Dynamic Forces, which had done all the different, signed comics and prints and collectibles, all that kind of stuff, into actual publishing. And, perhaps thought maybe he could just grab up these characters that weren't being used and scare people off with the high-powered lawyer. Similar, tactics, I guess you could say, were employed later to grab up a lot of the unused Golden Age characters that they used for Project Superpowers. Obviously, their Warlord of Mars and Lord of the Jungle titles neatly sidestepped the issue of the actual Edgar Rice Burroughs trademarks, just using the aspects of the characters that were in the public domain. So that's probably a subject for another video, but I find it very interesting nonetheless. Anyways, Valiant Intellectual Properties money runs out, and they end up settling out of court. So, at this point, 2 projects that Dinesh and Jason already had lined up are finally going to see print. And that is the Harbinger The Beginning hardcover, which collects the first 6 or 7 issues of the original Harbinger series, along with a new story by none other than Jim Shooter, who they were working with. And the Exo Manowar Birth hardcover, which does the same thing. It's the first 6 issues in the 0 issue of Exo Manowar. Both of these were digitally recolored, so this was a real treat for Valiant fans. They'd been waiting years to see anything new with these characters. And just like the Harbinger hardcover, the Exo also had a new short story by Jim Shooter. Now, Dinesh and Jason had gotten in touch with Jim Shooter, and we're going to have him be spearheading this new effort to relaunch the universe. They had everything lined up. They were going to relaunch in 2010 with Jim Shooter as editor-in-chief again. And of course, things didn't go as planned. One of the central things that they wanted to do was relicense the Gold Key characters. Now, if you remember from the previous video, Magnus Robot Fighter, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, and Solar Man of the Atom were the 3 original Valiant characters that were central to the original Valiant universe, but that Valiant did not own. They licensed them from Western Publishing, which was now under Classic Media because, legal stuff. It's always changing. But in late June of 2009, an agreement is reached between Valiant and Classic Media to license Magnus, Solar, and Turok from them. And Jim Shooter is very involved with this. 10 days later, a member of Classic tells Valiant that there was a rival bid from Dark Horse Comics, who also has Jim Shooter involved to write those books. Now, at this point, Dinesh and Jason go to Jim Shooter and tell him, hey, write a letter to Classic saying that you have no idea what this is about because you signed a non-compete with us. So obviously you don't know anything about this. You didn't actually sign on to write books for Dark Horse. This is no problem. Clearly just write this letter and clear it all up for them. Well, Jim waits 5 days, just long enough to bank his next paycheck from Valiant, and refuses to send the letter formally, and then the next day tenders his resignation to Valiant. 9 days after this, at San Diego Comic-Con, Dark Horse announces a new line of comics utilizing those 3 characters, spearheaded by Jim Shooter. Valiant immediately sues Shooter for breach of contract, and has to spend some time reeling because how much more could possibly go wrong? They should have fallen apart several times at this point. But they have a final stroke of luck. They managed to get in touch with ex-Marvel editor Warren Simons, who basically helps them to start building a team. And over the next few years, they're slowly behind the scenes building people up, and that is where we are going to pick up part 2 of this story with the actual publication of new Valiant comics. This is a twisty road to get here, between, you know, Acclaim having to go under right like they did, Dynamite getting involved and trying to block publication of this stuff for so long, and then Jim Shooter stabbing them in the back. I learned so much doing this, and I'm really glad I got to share it with you guys. As usual, remember the 3 S's: like, subscribe, and share. We will be back doing this again with part 2 in just a couple of days, so we will see you then.